Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today, I am just very delighted because we're embarking on a big journey. We started an introduction with Marcel on ideas on Julian Jaynes, and we are building on that. Julian Jaynes has had a profound impact on my life. I read him about 10 to 15 years ago, and his idea, really, one idea, the biggest idea that I got from him, I call it, mental space, that we create mental space in our head between our stimulus and response. And how that works, it looks like a very simple idea, but it is extremely powerful idea. And how it produces self-consciousness, how is it connected to language, how it is connected to writing, what is the evidence for it, but more than that, how do you actually use it today? Okay, I've internalized many of these things, but I've always found it very difficult to communicate to other people. Now, that is not unusual. All great innovators always take in everything that, in everything that is known at their times from every field and put things together in a different way. And most people who are used to just looking at one field really can't grasp what they're doing. They get lost in the details. So with Brian, we are going to try to make the core concepts of Julian Jaynes accessible to anybody. So we're going to start off by talking about core concepts of Julian Jaynes. Then, metaphors and language is one of the key things. So we will get into metaphors, but we're going to go slowly. Brian has been very gracious. He's agreed to do a series of 3 meetups. So it's going to be 3 Sundays. So today, 1 week from now, and another week from now. So we will build up the core today and keep building on it. And we really want to actually communicate these ideas, okay? We don't want to just say that, okay, here is the overview and now go away. No. What we want to do is, in the tradition of this 52 Living Ideas meetup, we want to actually engage you in a dialogue, okay? Please understand that this is extremely difficult point to communicate. We're talking about self-consciousness, okay? Consciousness, people mean so many different things by it. And it's very hard to establish the terminology and do that. So please be patient with yourself, with others you're talking to, and with us as we try to communicate what is the core concepts of Julian Jaynes. I promise you that if you get 10% of what he's saying, it's going to make your life better. You're going to be able to see something which is new. I just listened to a lecture by him, and he calls consciousness or self-consciousness the great inheritance, great cultural inheritance of all of us. And his argument that it is very new. It's only 30 generations old. So in that sense, we are actually building on it today. And what we are building on, how we're taking it forward, is significant. So that's what we are doing. So don't underestimate this enterprise. We're trying to improve our own ability to be self-aware, to be conscious. And we are helping each other do that. That's what we are trying to do, okay? And so I'm delighted to have Brian McVeigh here. He's written, I think, 17 books and probably he's writing another dozen that I don't know of. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
So Brian, when and how did you come across Julian Jaynes, and what's your story?
Well, actually, I was maybe 16, 17 years old, and my mother, who used to like to read books that were a little bit out there, you might say, came upon his book. She gave it to me. I read it. I was still in high school at that time. I didn't know what I wanted to do, of course. But when I read the book, something resonated. It just made a lot of sense to me at the time. And Perhaps it was because when I was young, I used to like to read ancient history, and I always wondered, how did these people actually experience space, time, the world? It seems so that I assumed it must have been very different. And I also have a brother who has autism. I often wondered how he experienced the world and if it was different from the way I did. And so that sort of laid the groundwork. And when I went to university, I ended up studying political science, Asian studies, and I went on to get a master's in anthropology. But Julian Jaynes was always in the background. Anytime I would read a book, whether it was modern history or the Middle Ages or ancient history or a book on linguistics, so I could always connect it to Jaynes. And actually, my PhD is in cultural anthropology, focused on Asia. And I tried to do a dissertation on spirit possession in Japan because, of course, that was one of the topics in Jaynes' book. And so I finished my dissertation. I got my PhD. No one really seemed interested. My dissertation committee was not happy with me because I was trying to learn from Julian Jaynes, who, by the way, his office was right across the alley from the building where the anthropology department is at Princeton University. And they never wanted to talk to other psychologists. They certainly did not want to talk to Julian Jaynes. So I really felt isolated. And in any case, I went on, I did some other projects in history, anthropology, and I decided that, I should really just focus on Julian Jaynes and not worry about trying to carve out an academic career at this point. So in any case, and some years ago, I went back and got another degree in mental health counseling. So I really believe that Julian Jaynes has so much to say in a range of different fields. But I also believe he has something practical to say about consciousness and how consciousness can be, for lack of a better term, improved. And one of the projects I'm working on now is what I call the self-healing mind, and how to take some lessons from Julian Jaynes about his definition of consciousness, build upon that, and apply it in the mental health field.
Wow. Wow. All right. So let's get started. So if we now let's take like 30,000 foot view. Try to place Julian Jaynes in kind of history of thought. If you want to say, what is the one concept, or in the most simplest way, what would people say 100 years from now, 200 years from now? What did Julian Jaynes contribute?
Well, I would start by saying that he showed us how to completely redefine a feature of the human condition that all of us, whether we're in academics or not, always assume is something that is inbuilt. We always assume that this feature, which is consciousness, somehow must have evolved millions of years ago, and it was a gradual process. And Jaynes said, no, that's not correct. Look at the evidence, and the evidence points to the fact that consciousness is a cultural invention, the same way that mathematics might be.
Mm-hmm.
And people, of course, have a difficult time with that because when they hear the word consciousness, all types of associations are evoked in their mind. They think it has to do with perception. They think it has to do with reasoning or thinking. And we really have to get past that idea and look at what Jaynes meant by the word consciousness, and then look at the historical record, and things start to make sense.
Wonderful. So let's do that. Let's not use the word consciousness for now. We can bring it back later on, because if we continue to use it, every time we use it, all these 39 people who are here are going to be thinking about different things. So though we are using a word, actually we are using different concepts in people's minds. So we're not going to be able to communicate. For me, the best thing that I know of thinking about this, the way in which Jaynes approaches this, is the concept of mental space, of saying that you're. What would you say if you said, okay, I can't use the word consciousness, but I want to describe to somebody what Jaynes is saying? What word or words would you use?
Well, I think that's a good place to start, as you suggested. Mental space. Related to that is the idea of mental images, and that's something that most people do have. It's something that if you ask someone, "What did you have for dinner last night?" or "What did you do this morning?" try to visualize it in your head. Most There are some exceptions, but most people can do that, and that I think is sort of, in fact, Jane said that mental space is the basic building block of consciousness because it's from the ability, well, actually, I would say the belief that we have a mental space in our head. It's from that one feature that the other features of consciousness have developed.
Perfect. So then let's just focus on the concept of mental space and make sure that that is clear to people. So the thing I'll say a few things and then I'll pass it to you and you can talk about mental space. So we're not talking about kind of how it came to be. Let's not talk about when it developed, things like that. We're saying, okay, just what is it? Um, this concept of mental space is a great demonstration of the use of metaphors. So people know what space is. It's like there is an immediate understanding of what space is. And when you say mental space, so there is, imagine like your head, I imagine like basically like a, not exactly a cube, but rectangular kind of shape, almost like a stage in my head, that I'm creating this internally. Now, what is the significance of it? Because what happens is that before having anything in the middle here, you have stimulus and response. You have things coming in and you're reacting to it. And there is nothing in the middle. There is just stimulus and response. It is, to use Kahneman's terms, it's just pure system one. It is your habitual response to familiar input. What the mental space does is that it takes in the stimulus still comes in, but then you are considering it. You're seeing yourself of saying, okay, what can I do? What would happen if I did this? What would happen if I did that? What is it that I'm trying to do? And how do I need to shape my actions in order to accomplish that? So all of that you're doing in your mental space, and then you act. But at this point, it is not a reaction, but it is, you are actually responding to the stimuli based on your mental space. So that's how I think about mental space and the use of it. Brian, how do you think about it?
Yes, I think that's a very good description. And a couple things I would emphasize. One is that mental space has a very practical application. Mental space is not some sort of extra add-on or epiphenomenon of cognitive processes. Mental space allows us to time travel in the past to look at mistakes that we made, how we can change and improve ourselves. It allows us to time travel into the future and come up with a menu of different choices. So the idea here is that it's something very useful. It allows us to better navigate the social and natural environment. A couple other things about mental space that I think are important is the way I view it. Of course, Jaynes talked about the role of hallucinations, bicameral hallucinations. Hallucinations, of course, are really an obsolete way, according to Jaynes, to to get through the world. They're not effective anymore for a variety of reasons. But I would argue that when we visualize something in our mental space, that is a type of hallucination. I call it a semi hallucination. Not exactly a full blown florid hallucination because we have voluntary control over our visualizations. They're not as strong, they're not as vivid, they're not as robust, but they are a type of hallucination. And one thing that you have to keep in mind about the ability to visualize in our minds is that, to the best of my knowledge, right now, there is no good physical explanation for how the mind is able to visualize things. I mean, we can trace the history of mental imagery and the language that developed the ability, the metaphors we use, that we know. That's what James did very successfully. But not to be too mystical about things, but I just find it fascinating that many psychologists seem to overlook the fact that as things stand now, we cannot physically explain the phenomena of mental imagery. And of course, people say, "Oh, yes, we can with neuroscience," but they
Mhm.
misunderstand, I think, the research results of what neuroscientists are doing. But in any case, that's how those are some of the important
Sure.
aspects, I think, of mental imagery.
Sure. Let me come at it slightly differently. This I came up with just last night when I was thinking about it. The word that I find actually most useful at this point is simulation. What you're
Yeah,
doing is that you're actually doing a simulation in your mind. Now, realize that simulation is a very profound thing, because what you're doing is that you are saying, okay, what would happen if I did this? What would happen would I do that? Do that. It is it is tremendously practical. So consider a particularly challenging human endeavor, that of a fighter pilot. Okay, the way fighter pilots train themselves are through simulation. You run through all the possible things in your mind and actually train yourself doing that. You're not actually fighting a plane, you're not flying a plane, you're in a simulator. But you do that so that when you actually are living, you are able to use all the learning that you've done through this simulation in order to live effectively. So, the purpose of the mental space is to simulate your life so that you can make your life better.
right,
Brian,
right.
what do you think?
Yes, and I think that's a very, very apt way to describe mental space and our ability to use mental images. Another term, related term that comes to mind is uh, virtual reality.
Mhm.
So when we use mental space, we're basically engaging in a type of homegrown virtual reality, if you will.
Yes, exactly. And you brought up the point about time. I think time is crucial, because I think time actually arises using something like this, using the mental space. Because if you look at the stimulus response model, you're always in the now. You're always reacting to something, and it's an immediate reaction.
Yes.
Whereas here is in the mental space, by doing the simulation, you are looking at the past and saying, okay, what were the past experiences I had that I need to use? You are projecting the future, and you're doing this when one of the key insights of Jaynes is that you're using space as a basis to actually, the time is like you're using a metaphor. You're taking time, because time, what is time? Time, we did a whole meetup on time and all kinds of views on time, but it's like, it's spatialization of time. You learn to think about time as if it was space. So you're using the metaphor of space, which you're more familiar with, to access something about future and past which you're not that familiar with, which is exactly what a metaphor does. Brian, would you talk a little bit more about time?
Well, yeah, so there's a lot of things to say about time, and one of the things I've been interested in is how different people in different periods, different places actually experience time. And I think the mistake some of us make is that time is one of these commonsensical things that everyone more or less experiences in the same way, sort of like breathing air or space itself. But actually, if you look at the historical record carefully, the the way people experience time was very, very different. And there's a lot I could say on this, but just say a couple of things. For one thing, the idea of linear time. The idea of linear time is a very modern concept. Now, in Christianity, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there is this idea of alpha omega, but the truth of the matter is, for most people in the classical or period or during the Middle Ages, when they thought of time, they thought of time in cyclical terms. And this was dictated by the economics of the agricultural tradition, of course. There was a very weak notion that time was an arrow that went far into the future. So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, in the Middle Ages, when they thought about the future was maybe 50 years, maybe 100 years, but they had no idea that future societies were going to be radically different. That's a very modern idea. And this idea, of course, is related to the notion of progress that
Mm-hmm.
was not invented until maybe the early 1800s,
Mm-hmm.
and the belief that science and technology can somehow improve our lives and that the future is going to be better. So we can see what Jaynes had to say about time actually has political and economic aspects. And once we start to investigate how people really thought about time, how they experienced time, we can see that time is a very flexible concept. There's nothing definite about time.
Absolutely. No, it's wonderful. We did, I study these, the great books, and Mortimer Adler has come up with these 103 great ideas. So they have these little essays which summarize what all thinkers have thought about each concept. So we did a meetup on time, and it was just incredible. Not only what all the novelists and scientists and philosophers and psychologists and sociologists and economists have to say about time, but what the actual group ended up actually bringing up points about time which were profound. So so these concepts like time or consciousness or language, they seem very simple,
Mm-hmm.
okay, but there is just tremendous richness in that. So I'm really delighted to be kind of unfolding these concepts with you, Brian. This is, I think, fantastic. Um, okay, so now, having established the mental space, the other thing that he has is the concept of analog I narrating itself in that mental space. Could you talk a little bit about his concept of analog I?
Well, I guess in simple terms, of course, when he wrote about analog I, the I represents your person. The I is sort of you might say, a simulated or
Mm-hmm.
virtual version of yourself in
Mm-hmm.
mental space. And it sounds like a simple notion because we take it for granted, just like in the same way we take space, time, and consciousness for granted. We don't usually deeply think about these things.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing with this idea of being able to miniaturize, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
yourself in your head. And it's very powerful because once you do that, you're able to move that I along the timeline, as we mentioned before, going in the past, going in the future, or perhaps going sideways into some sort of fantasy world. And so it's a very potent notion.
Wonderful. And what does he mean by narratization? So those three. So after mental space, I think the analog I mean, the way I see about analog I is that you're see again, contrast this to kind of stimulus response or system one. In stimulus response, something is just hitting you and you're just reacting to it. So there is nothing like your identity that you are asserting in the process. It's just a reaction. System one is just operating by itself, and it is amazing how much of your life is just that, of just system one. The analogy of elephant and the rider. Elephant is huge, rider is little at the top. It's very important, but it is relatively small. People ascribe all kinds of things. They think that they are the elephant, but they are not. They're riding on an elephant. Okay, that's one thing. How much of it is automatic? Analog I is kind of saying, whenever you have, it's an issue of identity. It's a very difficult issue, in some difficult concept in some sense, but a very simple concept in another sense. Okay, but it's kind of saying that it's to have kind of an independent eye, independent of the stimulus. So regardless of what is temporarily going on, what is your identity? That focus on that is what that is trying to do. Um, let's take the third concept of narratization. Can you
Okay.
talk a little bit about that?
Well, so narratization just means that because we use the metaphors that time occupies space from point A to point B, maybe to point C even, we can tell ourselves a story.
Mm-hmm.
We can uh, picture something that we did in the past and maybe regret that, or
Mm-hmm.
we can say we can learn from past experience. And basically, what happens is we build up not just one story, we build up many stories about ourselves, depending on what the circumstances are, depending on what we're trying to do. And this is where the notion of selfhood enters, because once we start building up all these different stories, we start narratizing a story in our head, we begin to believe these narratizations, we begin to believe these stories. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes it can be a bad thing. Sometimes we get stuck in these stories. And so, what I'm talking about now, I think, is a practical application of understanding a key feature of consciousness. For example, in mental health, there's what they call narrative therapy, and the idea is sometimes people get stuck in certain habits of thought, a certain pattern of behavior, because they have built up a narratization about themselves. But that narratization can be changed. So consciousness, the features of consciousness, such as an analog eye, there's hope there for us if we can change these things.
Wonderful. I think narratization is a huge deal. We've been studying work of Carl Jung, for example, who studies stories across time. And you see these stories repeat themselves, kind of core stories that are there in multiple cultures. And they served as a framework for as moral guidance, as the view of the world. So, and here we're talking about self-narratization. You are narratizing yourself. So it is the same kind of pattern, which is very, very old, but now you're doing it yourself. So you're changing the locus of the story from being outside you as a part of the social culture that you just are following to creating your own story. So those, I think, are the three main concepts. I think if people get that much, Brian, I think that they have a good starting point. What do you think?
Yes, I think you're right. I think
Okay. So then what we are going to do, as I want to make this interactive, I'm going to start the breakout rooms now. We're going to do 2 breakout rooms. Right now, we'll do breakout rooms just to discuss these 3 concepts. Okay, folks, I want you to just talk about these 3 concepts. Don't use the term consciousness. Just say there is mental space, there is analog eye, and there is narratization, self-narratization, okay? So just these 3 concepts, just talk about it. Now, we've got rules for the breakout rooms. The whole purpose of this, okay, because we're trying something very ambitious. We're trying to communicate Julian Jaynes' thought to you. Now, there are maybe about 10 people out of these 45 who know Julian Jaynes fairly well. So hopefully there will be some of them in your breakout room. And so we have certain rules in the breakout rooms for those who are new. I'm going to put them in the chat momentarily here. These rules are designed to make the breakout rooms as effective as possible. Okay, so here are the rules. Give me a second. Okay, so what you do is that you start the breakout room by letting everybody speak for 1 to 2 minutes about their takeaways, their thoughts about whatever has been presented about these 3 concepts, okay? And then you have a discussion. So that way everybody is engaged. Second, we've got these rules that have worked very well for us. Keep on topic, Be brief, be courteous, and encourage others to speak. Don't hog all the speaking time. And if needed, you can just click on there is a button for ask for help. Okay. And I'll help you. All right. So we're going to do the breakout rooms for only 20 minutes. We'll come back. And then when you come back, you will have a chance to talk for about a minute on your takeaways as well as questions. And then we are going to deal with all the takeaways and questions as and when you say it. So you can either give only a takeaway or only a question, or you can give a takeaway and a question. And both Brian and I will respond to all of them. Once we've done that, we're going to be talking about metaphors and language, and then we'll do another set of breakout rooms. Okay, I'm starting the breakout rooms now. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. So now it's time for takeaways and questions. So what we're trying to do now is we are actually, Brian and I are actually trying to communicate Julian Jaynes' ideas, and we want to do it in detail. So we have got 3 meetups lined up for that, but we want to do it step by step. And we want to hear from you because both of us have tried, Brian a lot more than me, but me too, to some extent, to actually communicate with people. And we've had all kinds of difficulties, some amazing successes, some difficulties. So we want to hear from you. So now I'm inviting everybody to share your takeaways from what you heard about Julian Jaynes or what you know about Julian Jaynes. Suppose, so let me give you 2 examples. So suppose you're not familiar at all, then please tell us your takeaways and tell us any questions that you have. Okay, try to go for only 1 or 2 questions. We can't do too many questions, but pick the best questions, the most important questions. I recommend that you approach it at a personal level. Do not talk about, okay, that theory says that and that theory. Talk about it to you. What do these concepts presented so far of mental space, analog eye, and narratization mean to you? You see what kind of use you see of it, what kind of problems, what kind of contradictions you see. We want to hear your take from your own experience, because that is the best way of grounding new concepts. Okay. Now, if you're familiar with Julian Jaynes, then I invite you you can spend up to 2 to 3 minutes talking about what you have gotten from Julian Jaynes, because we want others to hear many voices of what people have walked away, what people have gotten from Julian Jaynes, not just me and Brian. So those are the things. Now, we've got 4 rules that have worked really well for us. We've used it for 5 years. Rule number 1, raise your hand in Zoom or type exclamation mark in chat in order to speak. And I invite everybody to speak, because the way it works is that you get 10 times the value when you speak as opposed to just listen, because you're producing something and you actually listen in order to speak. So speaking is very important, and you get feedback from it. And we definitely want to hear from you. So I encourage everybody to speak. So first rule is type exclamation mark or raise your hand. Rule number 2, keep on topic. Right now, we are just talking about those 3 concepts of Julian Jaynes and what you're getting from them. Rule number 3, be brief. There are, about 40 people on the call, so we want to make sure that we get to hear from everybody. The next rule is speak your mind. Feel free to disagree with anybody on anything, and do so courteously. All right. So with that, let's get started. First up is going to be Victor, followed by Tom. Victor.
Well, thank you so much. And Brian had wonderful things to say in our breakout room. And Brian, I have a particular question. So the idea of narratization and self-narratization. So I understand the value in knowing what kind of stories that we are telling ourselves, and to purify or to cleanse ourselves through taking out the wrong parts of it. I do understand that. And at the same time, does Julian Jaynes provide any kind of procedure how to apply in real world to myself in this case?
Go ahead, Brian, you're on mute. Brian, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So if I understand your question, I think you're asking, did Julian Jaynes himself offer any advice on how to alter or improve an individual's self-narratization? Is that correct?
That's the question. Yes.
Uh, he did not himself, but it's something that I've been thinking about. And I mentioned before in mental health counseling, there is what they call narrative therapy. And narrative therapy offers a set of tools for a person to change their narrative or to examine narratives or stories they tell themselves that have not been useful. And so I won't go in, for the sake of time, I won't go into detail now about that. But what I would suggest is just go online and look under narrative therapy to get some particular techniques on how anyone can alter their storyline or their self-narratization.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, Victor. Next up is going to be Tom, Brian, and Mike. Tom.
Okay. So I sense there's some tools here, like Brian was hinting, but for ordinary communication, like public speaking or writing, maybe with regard to stories and how powerful they are. Any practical conclusions we can draw from this?
Well, I think you mentioned, if I heard you, writing stories.
Yeah.
And yes, in fact, that's one of the techniques in narrative therapy, is you're asked to write a story about yourself, because what happens is that gives you almost a mirror. It sounds like a very simple exercise, but actually it can be very powerful, because when you have to write out a story about something that happened to you, something you're worried about, maybe it was a trauma, something that's bothering you, when you write it out, you're actually telling yourself something that perhaps parts of your mind did not know, or parts of your mind have not yet processed.
Q. Next up is going to be the great-hearted Brian. Great heart.
Yes, I'll just say I'm one of those who really knows nothing about Julian Jaynes, but I'm very excited to learn based on all the references that have been made to him in 52 Living Ideas. I'm very interested in, if you will, the structure of thought and the process of thinking and feeling and perception and all of that. So I'm really, really excited. I hope that the old hands here have not also lost the sense of excitement.
Brian, I think we are having problem with your internet connection. When you come back in, we'll continue with you.
Okay.
Brian, no, okay, you're back. You're back. Go ahead. You said something about old hands, and then we lost you. Didn't know what you said about old hands.
I hope that the old hands have not lost the sense of excitement about this, because I can assure you it all seems very exciting to me. Thank you.
Wonderful, Brian. Great, thanks. Next up is going to be Mike, Kevin, Ben, Jennifer, Judith, and Linda. Mike, I'll give you 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Thank you. I've heard of Julian Jaynes, read some of his stuff. I've even heard of you, Brian, and read some of your stuff. There's another name that I want to bring into this that telescopes into what you've been talking about, and that is Daniel Dennett and the memes. Something happened 5,000 years ago.
Mike, let's not go away from the topic.
No, I think this is a short, couple sentences and short. That the consciousness changed when language developed, when written language developed, and that's Daniel Dennett and Graham Hancock talks about that, and Penrose in his stuff. a baby, like an artificial intelligence computer, is born without any wiring. All the neurons are there. Are even more neurons than he has now. But the wiring, the white matter, is not there. And so culturally, society, his parents, the environment teaches him how to walk, how to talk, how to invent things. So we're different than we were before the iPhone. And similarly, civilization began with writing. Now, one more point, and then I'll go away. I know you've studied Japanese. There's a difference in how people learn, whether they read left to right with a syllabic thing, right to left, or with vowels or without vowels in their syllabic things, or with pictorial pictures, pictorial language. And that's another meme that essentially created civilization. When the singularity comes, as Ray Kurzweil says, one sentence, I'll go away. When the singularity comes, people with that, with the artificial intelligence computer, some of the people, the great man theory, some of the people will be able to do miraculous things and solve all the world's problems. So I'd appreciate your concept as to what language has to do and some of the other drivel that I've poured out on this group.
No, thank you. That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I'm always conflicted when you speak because, I really appreciate and greatly respect the range of your thought. And so it's you always have, kind of historical background and know what we're talking about. At the same time, you have a tendency of going off in all kinds of directions. So, and I have to kind of keep things on topic. And so we're going to do a meetup completely just for yourself where we can just do meandering through all of knowledge. And I look forward to that. But thank you very much. And I do agree that writing is a huge step, and so does Julian Jaynes. So we'll get to that point about writing. And what I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to keep narrowly focused right now on Julian Jaynes concepts so that we can get them. And that's what we're trying to do. So that's why, I'm keeping it, narrow. But you can talk, so folks, let's continue. We're going to go to Kevin, Ben, and Jennifer next. Kevin.
Yes, thank you. My question want to back to the basics. We talk about analog eye. Is it similar to the mind of eye? How about the other stuff? How do you different from a physical eye? And also from, if I can talk more about the mental space, would be great. Thank you.
Okay. So I didn't understand completely your question. I think you compared the analog eye to something else. Could you
physical eye. So you're saying, what is the difference between analog eye and physical eye?
I see. Yes. So the analog eye is just a miniaturized, simulated, virtualized version of the physical eye. And so the analog eye allows us to do things in our mental space that we ordinarily would not do, perhaps because it's too dangerous or we're not too sure what the outcome would be. So the analog eye gives us a sort of test run, as it were, on how to behave in the more dangerous, risky physical world.
Yeah, that's excellent question, Kevin, because we didn't spend that much time on analog eye. So the best way to understand it is to look at somebody like Odysseus, who is in the middle of all kinds of trouble. And he's saying, okay, what should I do? And he's trying to run all kinds of scenarios. If I did this, what would happen? Oh, I will get into trouble with this god. Well, if I did this, I will be able to go past this one, but that's going to be so it's kind of like imagining, instead of physical eye is your kind of bodily physical you, whereas analog eye is a conception of you, like an image of you in your mental space, trying out many scenarios, projecting into the future, sometimes remembering yourself back and working with that as an abstraction, as a concept. Okay, next
Thank
up.
you.
I'm sorry,
you're
I have
welcome.
one quick question. Is that almost like using yourself as like an avatar to
Yes, that would be a good way of putting it. That would be a good way of putting it. But Janelle, what we're going to do is that we take the rule here is that whenever you want to speak, just go ahead and type exclamation mark. We'll keep coming through these themes again and again. Okay, or you can type in chat. That's fine too. Next up is going to be Ben, Jennifer, and Judith. Ben.
Thank you very much. In our breakout room, it was room number 1, we had some interesting conversation, went off, yes, on some tangents, but I think that they were valuable in terms of making comparisons and metaphors of all things between the human mind and machine intelligence and the possibility of creating machines that actually have that analog eye and so forth. But taking that metaphor back to the human brain as a programmable thing, I think that concept, ideas like Bill, who was in the breakout, mentioned Marshall McLuhan, another Canadian, as Jaynes was, who talked about the medium and when it was oral tradition, when it became print, and now we have television and digital, that it has actual effects on what we do with that analog eye and that mental space that we've created. And we have Berger and Luckman, who wrote years ago about the social construction of reality. And what I'm getting at here is, I think there's a difference between how the brain gets programmed. A child in Japan, a child in Germany, a child in the Amazon comes up with a whole different programming. They have the same machinery. It's the same machinery, but they wire it. It's gradually differently in the early years, and then kind of discard the possibility of using other mental connections. It brings up a question. I'm not sure how to articulate it exactly, but the difference between that kind of programming, the cultural stuff, versus what happened with the switch from bicamerality to so-called modern, or what we think of now as self-consciousness of personality of me. And clearly there are differences within existing populations on how that works too. So I think that there's a lot to be explored there, and it's hard to talk about because there's, I think it's easy to confuse the program versus how the machine deals with the program. So there, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Go ahead, Brian.
Well, yeah. So there's a couple of things I would say in response. One metaphor that people use for Jaynes is the difference between hardware and software. And for Jaynes, we would say that consciousness, or the features of consciousness, to be more specific, mental imagery, spatialization, narratization, these are software. So, but with that said, that software, even though there are cultural differences around the world in modern times, the basics of the software are the same. So, for example, in Japan, where I lived many years, of course, people were conscious. But I suppose if I paid close attention, if I was somehow able to do some study, I could see that Japanese culture does emphasize certain features over other features when it comes to a baseline of consciousness. And to add to that, one final thing I would say is that actually there are differences between individuals when it comes to consciousness. So there's no one way to be conscious. It's such a subtle, complex thing that even among individuals within the same culture, there are differences.
Yeah, and Ben, I really appreciate the kind of level of observations and stuff, because that is exactly what we need in order to contend with this topic. So we are actually seeing not only kind of mental spaces, but we are saying, okay, what is the mental space in Ben's head right now? What is it that he is grasping about this? And what is it that I'm grasping? And what is the connection between that? And it is enormously difficult to talk about, but enormously rewarding to talk about. Because if you get one idea from somebody about how to think, how to be more conscious, how to use this apparatus better. And the crucial thing is that it is a cultural heritage. So this is something that we as human beings have created very recently, and it is there in our hands right now. And we are in this process of conversation working on it. So that's the kind of glory of what we're doing, and that's the difficulty of what we are doing. But it is well worth the difficulty. Next up is going to be Jennifer, Judith, and Linda. Jennifer.
So Rebecca just brought up the question that I was going to talk about, and that was something we touched in a breakout room, is the idea of cultures. Do different cultures have different ideas of analog I and different ideas of self-narration? I'm bilingual and I've spent a lot of time in Hispanic cultures, and I feel like not only my cultural interpretation or my language skills change within the culture, but also the way I think about the world. There's a shift that happens at a much deeper level. So Brian, can you speak to the idea of cultural experiences of the mental space, the analog I, and the self-narration?
Well, I think a good way to answer this question is, if we want to understand how a specific culture uses.
Okay, sorry, it looks like there is a slight pause from Brian's side. I've noticed that it's going to come back very soon. Okay, so whenever it comes back, so let me go ahead and answer that. Now, I've not studied
Consciousness or uses mental space.
Brian, sorry, there was a break in your answer. Can you start over? There was a big interruption. Go ahead.
Sure. So that's a very good question about cultural differences. And what I would say is, what we have to do to find out what those differences are is we have to get to know the culture very, very specifically, because the differences in consciousness among different cultures is going to be very subtle. It won't necessarily be very obvious.
Okay, Brian is still having difficulty with the audio. Let's see. I'm going to give it a couple of seconds. Okay. So I can speak a little bit because though I'm not
Might
studied.
be sometimes, but
Brian, we're having difficulty with your audio. So do you have any other applications running on your computer that you can close? Folks, don't worry, we'll fix it one way or the other. At most, we'll have to cut the video. He's in Albany, and I think his upload is not as good. So Brian, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, we lost you in the middle. But let me just quickly respond to Jennifer a little bit. So I think there are cultural differences, but the differences, see, it's just like America, right? In America, I have lived on the East Coast and West Coast, and I see them as being very different. But somebody from India, they see America as America. They don't see the differences. So within India, you say, okay, that's India. But you go to India, there are all these kind of subcultures. So there are variations, but there are commonalities. And so I think there is to all the kind of written, cultures who have the heritage of written language, have certain things in common. And then there are variations between that. So let me go to the next one. Next one is going to be Judith, Linda, and Seth. Judith.
Yeah, so Ben and Jennifer actually touched on the things that I'm had questions about, or I'm struggling with. I'm trying to remain open about this. This is new to me, but I'm still in, you know, in the breakout room, we did touch on this also, but I struggle with the concept of evolutionary biological changes and then social and cultural influences, that schizophrenia is like a physical vestige.
No, let's not jump over there, because we are deliberately kind of come up with a program which establishes the basic ideas first and then take advanced ideas later on, because otherwise we're all going to get lost. So
Okay.
let's talk about, Judith, what do you think about these ideas that were presented about the mental space, analog I, and narratization? We will come to all these ideas, but we'll probably come to it in the third, meetup.
Well, then I guess I'm just jumping prematurely. I mean, people have mental spaces. There's an analog I. We tell ourselves stories. I think that's everywhere. That all makes sense to me. Yes.
But I do want to address one thing that you're saying about kind of evolutionary things and cultural things. Firstly, I want to say that it is an enormously difficult topic to figure out, because this is a field which Jaynes pretty much invented of kind of psychological anthropology, okay, or archaeology, like trying to dig up what was it like in early stages and trying to figure out from that what the psychology of that time was. So it's enormously difficult. There is tremendous, we like yesterday we did a meetup on the work of Jack Panksepp on development of emotions in mammals. And it's fantastic amount of work that is going on that. So, and what we are learning is that just the basic evolutionary capabilities that human beings have are tremendous, are huge. I mean, with that, but on the top of that sits the cultural capacities. And it is important to make distinctions between that. And we can all argue about where those distinctions are. And those are enormously difficult topics. And that's exactly what we are doing, and Jaynes, his main point, the main argument, and we will go ahead, and we are again not presenting the evidence for it today of saying what is evolutionary and what is that. We are just saying that this is the concept of consciousness. That's all we're kind of putting on the table right now. Then we'll slowly develop the idea of how it came to be and what is the evidence of that. Maybe in the second one, we can do that. Okay. But thanks. We will keep coming to this theme of what is evolutionary and what is cultural. Next up is going to be Linda, followed by Seth. Linda.
I find self-narratization to be the most important of the topics today. And we need to make sure that there's a sync between that self-narratization and what other people are seeing. And that can lead to all kinds of problems. I'd really like to hear, a question came up in our meeting about whether there had been more work done on this, the differences between our narratization and the world's, and apparently there has not been a lot of work done in this particular topic by the author.
Yes. So, to respond to that, Linda, I would say if you are interested, look at literature in psychotherapy and mental health, because of course that's a key theme in mental health disorders. This idea that I have a very negative view of myself, but when I ask other people and I investigate it objectively from their perspective, actually, there's nothing wrong with me. So why do I have this low self-esteem, or I deny things, whatever the case may be? So I would start with the literature in mental health counseling.
Okay, and Linda, you're right that self-narratization is actually the heart of all of this, because the mental space, analog I, and narratization, the whole purpose of creating the mental space is to do self-narratization, is to say, what if I did this? What would happen in the future? So self-narratization is like the culmination of this process of mental space, analog, and narratization. Absolutely. Next up is going to be Seth. Seth, go ahead. Followed by George, I think. Seth.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. This is my first time being here to this group. And Jaynesian psychology or thought is brand new. I just discovered it today and this morning. And I did a little research.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I spent in order to prepare myself, I did a little research. And so the concept of consciousness and evolution, I think,
we don't want to.
Oh, am I jumping the gun?
You're jumping the gun because we're not
okay.
even talking about consciousness. We are trying to present this step by step. So what you're starting out.
Okay.
So let's
I
go
thought
ahead.
Right. Okay. So I get my question would be if I want to catch up on narratization and analog eye and mental space, what would be the best course of action for me just to kind of bring myself up to speed?
Well, I would start with Jaynes, or if you have read Jaynes, review exactly what he said about it, and then it sounds simple. I would just type in Google narration, self-narration, and you will find actually a lot of information. That information you find won't be necessarily through a Jaynesian lens. It won't be related to a Jaynesian interpretation, but the fact that we talk about narration a lot tells us, I think, what an important role it plays. So, like I said, start with Jaynes and then just go online and you'll find a lot of information.
Yeah, and I would definitely recommend reading Jaynes in original. That's his book. I put a link to that, Origins of Consciousness in the breakdown of bicameral mind. That is really, you really need to read that because I wouldn't rely just on commentaries. And I would invite you to keep coming back. We're going to do this.
Yes, absolutely. I'm excited.
Go ahead and do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Next is George. George, go ahead. George Best.
Thank you, Shrikant. Yeah, this is a great group. Glad to be back after the previous session with Marcel. I think it's difficult to stay on topic. It's really an amazing set of things that Julian Jaynes connected. But talking about how to talk about this, I find Julian Jaynes' description of what he calls consciousness, or what some people call introspection, very good, so that we separate what we're talking about and what we should not be talking about, right? So this metaphorical description based on language and the way that enables the creation of the mental space and the analog eye, again, just as you said, without reading his original book, it is almost impossible to stay on topic, right? So those first two chapters in which he describes what consciousness is not, and then I think it's super brilliant the way he describes what he's talking about, this description about these features, the mental space, the spatialization, the narratization, as based on language. Without language, without metaphorical descriptions, you could not have this. The narratization, I wanted to share, I mean, there's many ways to see the importance, the value of narratization, the fascination, the love of storytelling, the stories, books, movies, but even in sales, right? As a salesperson, you need to learn how to connect with your audience, with your buyers, and telling a story or creating a story for them to see themselves buying your product, buying your service, is another way in which narratization and storytelling connects in a day-to-day life. But again, for the people that are new to Julian Jaynes, I don't see a way to really understand what he's talking about without reading his book, right? What is this very narrow, very specific definition of consciousness based on language?
Thank you. Thank you, Jorge. I really appreciate that. And folks, I mean, what we are trying to do is that we are trying to present the core concepts here to give you enough motivation to go read the book. And I have read it multiple times. I find that I have had to read, and every time I go back and reading it, I was just reading it last night, I get more from it. So so I would definitely recommend that. But also come and talk to us and tell us what you're, I would recommend start reading get the book now. I put the link there and start reading it and come ask questions. This is a great opportunity. It took me like 10 plus years to kind of try to understand it. You may be able to do it faster, maybe 2 years, if you engage with everybody. Next up is Govert, followed by Rebecca. Govert, go ahead. You need to unmute yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. I'm very excited to see Professor McVeigh first time live. We have occasional meetings online, a little bit by email too. My little contribution is so one of the things of consciousness is also the idea of conciliation.
Mm-hmm.
How to, put together in an efficient way the multiplicities of life, inner life, outer life, social life, physical life, biological life, etc., etc. So one way to conciliate stuff is to put everything into language. And as far as we're talking about 3 concepts, I always think like, well, if I have 3 concepts and I want to understand their interconnection, let's try to put it in one sentence. So you have to use the scaffolding of grammar and predication and everything that goes into, the requirements of language to make sense. So I came up with the following. The analog I is a character in one's self-narratization, which for modern man happens in his or her mind space. So boom, all 3 concepts just in one little phrase, and I hope it makes sense. And I have 2 little amendments to it about narratization. The first one is that we should not only think about self-narratization, but also cultural narratization. That the differences in cultures is very often because of their own meta-narratization. Every culture has its own story. Every culture tells its own story, and when you grow up in a culture, you get conditioned or socialized into that story. You might have your own sub-story, but you're still kind of part of the bigger story. The second amendment or little footnote here is that we have to think differently about story and narratization. I did a little, my background is philosophy. Narratives are very efficient epistemic tools to conciliate and simplify life and make it such that as an individual and as a group, we can, have better survival chances. So here I'm plugging it back into evolution, which is a whole different topic. But that's my my little contribution here. Thank you.
Wonderful, Govert. This is really brilliant. Thank you so much. I've put my email address. If you could send me an email, I would love to hear more about your research thesis, and we can take it from there. I really am really fascinated by the idea of kind of individual narrative and cultural narrative and interaction between that. And the way in which I think about this is that, I kind of, to make it easy, I separated it out into 3, but I also think of it as just one phrase, because I think of it as a verb, of saying that, I'm doing something, because I could be doing it or not doing it. I could be just operating on the stimulus response model. So when I am aware, self-aware, I am basically, my analog I is narratizing in my mental space. So that's what I'm to do. My to do is that, keep doing that, So wonderful. Thank you very much, Govert. Really appreciate that. Next up is Rebecca. Rebecca followed by Jade. Rebecca, you need to unmute yourself.
I think she left.
Oh, okay. Oh, really? Okay, I see. Okay, so go ahead. Next up is Jade. Jade, you had questions.
My question was basically somewhat of an observation. It's kind of the concept of people were talking about their internal narrative and it being in alignment or not in alignment with the culture. Wait, it was more about regard. I'd have to read what I wrote because I kind of wrote out the question. But my thing is that it's hard because I'm not remembering everything that person said to respond directly, but it's more like the DSM kind of adjusts itself, and the DSM is like the psychological diagnostic, whatever. It's just like homosexuality. Homosexuality was something that people did not regard well externally, the world, the society, but internally, the people might have regarded themselves well. And because of that, we've externally changed, I guess, our communal analog of what is okay to match the internal analog of what is okay. And it's just like if you had a prize fighter, right? And he's sitting there in his internal narrative, he sees people on TV fighting, that's great. He goes, he becomes a prize fighter, he's on the top of the heap, right? He takes that and he thinks, okay, beating people up, putting it into like all these different situations. He goes, I don't know, to the corner store. He does these same exact moves, beat somebody up, external narrative, he's an awful brute. So it's tricky. It's very, very tricky. That's all I'm saying. It's hard. Because it's not just culture, it's context. Because even within a culture, what's acceptable in one context is not acceptable in another. So your internal narrative of your analog and the external narrative of the analog must adjust accordingly.
Very interesting. Thank you. Brian, would you like to comment on it?
Yes, I think that's a very good way to look at things. And it sort of what you said, it's almost a warning, I think, about how we have these intellectual structures, these fields of inquiry. For example, the DSM-5, which is sort of the Bible for psychotherapists and for psychiatrists, that sort of tells us how we should give diagnosis, but it also actually tells us how we should value and judge other people. So we have to be very, very careful. But I think the most important thing you said is the complexity about narratizations, about how not only do I have one narratization about myself, I probably have multiple narratizations about myself, depending on the context, depending on the social context. So this just shows us how subtle and complicated these discussions can be when we look at things like mental space, analog I, and self-narratization.
Wonderful. We'll take one more from Stefan, and then we will start our discussion on metaphors. Stefan.
Yeah, so I hope this isn't too overly simplistic, but is mental space something that you can increase? And if so, how?
That is not a simplistic question at all, and in fact, it's a very good question. And I would answer that yes, you can. In the same way that you can exercise your muscles and your body, you can exercise your mind, and you can increase your mental space. In fact, that's in the historical record, going back to the Greco-Roman world, where people started to become conscious the way we think of it. People who engaged in rhetoric would actually practice how to expand their mental space. And I don't have the details of the research on that, but actually there has been some research on how people have tried to do that historically. So that's a fascinating topic.
I actually have a completely well-tested method for doing that, and that is called writing and drawing diagrams. Because what you're doing is, and that's exactly the function of writing, because what it does is that it starts to take something that is in your head and you're putting it down on paper, and you can look at it, you can check it, you can correct it, you can connect it, and you can write something. For me, like the pictorial thing, I'm very visual. So for me, actually drawing all these, like if I'm trying to figure out something, drawing it as a plan, drawing it as a diagram on a piece of paper it's a way of expanding what you can hold. And then I can hold it in my mind because I am seeing it too. So it's a way of extending of how much you can hold in this mental space using writing. And that's why writing has changed civilization. It's not just a matter of communication between people. It is a tool for thinking. It is a tool of expanding your consciousness, expanding your mental space. So let me ask you one question, Brian. Let's now go on to our presentation, continuing the presentation. Let's start with writing. What do you think is the role, what does Jaynes think is the role of writing? And then we will go directly into metaphors. Brian, you're frozen. Okay. As usual, you'll be back in a couple of seconds, so we'll continue at that point. So I do think that writing is fundamental, and writing originally started with the Sumerians. Again, Brian, can you hear me? Brian, are you back? Okay, let's see what's going on with Brian. Brian, you're on mute.
Okay. Can
Yes,
you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Yes.
So the question is about writing. We did not hear anything from you. So question, what do you think is the role of writing as per James?
Right. Yeah. So I think the gods must have heard me talking and they cut out my connection completely. So hopefully they won't do that again. But I think Jaynes talked about how writing as a new technology increased certain cognitive skills. And in a sense, it actually gave us a new spatiality. It gave us a new spatiality in the physical world to look at things, and it gave us a new spatiality within our heads to imagine writing what we're doing. And so writing, as we all know, is one of the most important, probably the most important technology ever invented. So in any case, there's a lot more I could say about that, but just to sort of highlight the most important points about writing as a new technology.
Wonderful. So let's move on to metaphors. Brian, what are metaphors?
Okay. So a metaphor simply is using words to describe something that you're having a very difficult time explaining. And many times as societies change, and societies can change very rapidly, we have new phenomena, new experiences, and so we need new metaphors. And what Jaynes argued is that around 1000 BCE, the late Bronze Age collapse, to be more specific, things were so chaotic, so many civilizations had collapsed, that is really when we see a change in metaphors, how people describe their psychological experiences.
Can you give some examples?
Well, actually, yes. I don't know if you can see this. If everyone.
No, you will need to hear. Yeah, hold it right in front of. Yes. Yeah. Now we can see it close. Yeah.
So probably some of you know that's the Japanese word ki, and it comes from a Chinese word qi. If you've done martial arts or if you know Chinese medicine, you'll be very familiar with it. And if you look, I think you can see.
Okay. Brian, we are having trouble with your audio again.
What it means.
Okay, let's do one thing. Brian, let's do one thing. Let's cut out the video. Can you pause the video? That'll improve the quality of audio considerably. There won't be any pauses.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to stop the video for you. Okay. Okay, there. Go ahead.
Right. So, in any case, that word, you can't see it now, but in Japanese, the word is ki, and it means air, vapor. It probably comes from, in ancient times, this idea of the vapor from steamed rice had a certain vitality. And now in modern Japanese, there are maybe, I don't know how many, a couple of hundred words that use that one word key that means air, atmosphere, to mean mind, spirit, emotions, feelings, and anything else that we might describe as a psychological event. So that's a very good example of a metaphor that has survived throughout the centuries.
Excellent. What is the role of metaphors in language?
Well, as I said, it's a way to describe something that we don't have the words for yet. So we're struggling. And there may be things in the universe that we're always going to need metaphors for. But actually, so much of language is based on metaphor. Metaphor is not a decorative aspect of language. It's not an ornament. Metaphor is how language works. Metaphor is how we cognitively process information.
Wonderful. Jaynes talks about how metaphors are essential or inescapable in dealing with concepts of consciousness, because I do not have an access to consciousness of other people directly. So how do we actually talk? So what role do metaphors play in development of concepts of consciousness?
Well, metaphors do a lot of different things in relation to consciousness. For one thing, metaphors give us a physical space for where our mental events are taking place. So if I say I'm thinking about riding a bike, I'm not really riding a bike. I'm riding a bike I think I'm riding a bike in my head. But the truth of the matter is, there is no bike in my head. But nevertheless, it's a very powerful way to position information, to position a person. So that's just one example of what metaphors do. Metaphors also allow us to provide a much more subtle and nuanced description of what we're feeling. And that goes a long way in improving communication between Homo sapiens.
Now, you wrote an entire book on a psychohistory of metaphors. So what did you write about?
Well, yeah, so that's quite let me just say that I view that book as a continuation of Jaynes' work. And also I had a very difficult time giving it a title because it's interdisciplinary and it looks at a number of things, and it looks at things that we don't ordinarily think about: space and time and the experience of consciousness. And if I had to give a basic or a simple explanation of what the book is about, it's about how the human experience of time, space, and psychological events have changed throughout the centuries.
Okay, I mean, this is very intriguing. So let's see. Let's just talk about time. How has the conception of time changed over time?
Well, the biggest change is that in pre-modern societies, time was almost always conceived in cyclical terms. There was no linearization of time. And when we started to become conscious about 3,000 years ago, that allowed us to spatialize time, to think of time metaphorically as having a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that actually improved a lot of political economic projects in society. That allowed for more planning. It allowed for a better calculation. It allowed people to be more, for leadership in, for example, pre-modern societies, to be more rational about how to allocate resources. All types of things that we take for granted in the modern world. But by around the late 1700s, early 1800s, there was another major change in time that I think has to do with consciousness, but it's difficult to connect the dots. But in any case, as I mentioned before, this new version of time, beginning in the early mid-1800s, was about progress. So the idea is that there is a future, a distant future, and that future is the new heaven. Heaven no longer is a place in another world. Heaven is no longer something in the past. Heaven is in the future. And if you stop and think about it, our governments, our economic systems, our consumption patterns, our hopes, our fears, it's all based on this new linear view of time that allows for a belief in progress. Progress, I think, is a new religion that actually, and we take it for granted. It's a sort of almost a non-conscious type of religion, this belief in progress. But the reason why I stress that is because, before the 19th century, there was really no notion of progress, no notion that you could socially re-engineer your political economic systems.
Wonderful. I want to connect it up with one thing that I found, one observation that I made a few years ago that I found really amazing. I was looking at idioms because English uses idioms a lot. And I was looking at history of idioms, of when did many of the idioms in use today came out, became prevalent. And there is an explosion. There are idioms being added, century by century, but 19th century, the idioms just take off. Okay. So, and it's interesting to see how it works. So for example, whenever there is, so firstly, 19th century, there's this, industrial revolution, and the world starts changing at a really rapid pace. So it's a very different, like before that, a grandfather's life is not that different from grandson's life. Whereas after industrial revolution, things change fast and you have all kinds of new things. So for example, take just railroads, right? So when railroads came about, you have all these idioms like, he has a one-track mind, keep on track, just blowing off steam, fire in the belly, just, it just goes on and on. So each of the human enterprises of this is all about going places, right? Going in a directional way, in a planned way, and all kinds of things that are connected with that. Those phrases come from this human experience and they become, parts of our language that we use to describe human behavior, human emotions.
Yes. And so that shows us how quickly things can change. And as you discussed, in the 19th century, because of industrialization and science and technology, we were actually able to shrink time and space. And we're still doing that. We can get from point A to point B much faster than we could 100, 200 years ago. And this shows us how changes in technology and economics shape our cognition. They shape our very experience of space and time.
Wonderful. Let me ask you about this. Very few people actually live. Let me step back one step. If you look at the, when you look at people at large, the West has developed very differently from, let's say, China or India. And all these three are very large civilizations who have developed in their own way. You are unusual, just like many immigrants, have, like for me, I've lived half my life in India, half my life here. So I've got two bases and two kind of sets of languages and sets of metaphors that I can work with. You've spent almost, 20 years or so in Asia. What did you learn about language and metaphors as having these, having been exposed to a culture that different?
Well, what I learned is that despite the differences, despite the linguistic differences, there are important metaphors. There are important commonalities when it comes to trying to understand how metaphors shape consciousness. At the same time, the differences between English, Japanese, Chinese cannot be ignored. If we want, we have to really pay attention to those differences. So, for example, in Japanese, they do use the heart a lot as a metaphor. Not so much the head, but often the heart, and also that word I pointed out before, ki. Ki is probably the most common. Whereas in Chinese, if I remember, they use heart a lot. I don't know if they use ki or chi as much as the Japanese do. And then, of course, in English, we like to use head and heart. And I think we like to use head actually a lot more. That's just a speculation on my part. I don't know. But in any case, it's a whole nother question, of course, what those differences mean. But I guess what I'm trying to say, there are commonalities in the metaphors, body parts, but there are also differences that we have to be sensitive to.
Wonderful. Now let's see, we are at about 1:52. So what I want to do is I want to kind of look forward a little bit. What do you think? I mean, this is we'll do explicit planning, after this meetup. But let's just give a little bit of preview to people. So today we just talked about 3 basic concepts from Jaynes, and then we talked a little bit about language and metaphors. What do you think? What are the other key concepts of Jaynes do you think we will need to cover in the next 2 meetups? You can try turning your video on and let's see if it works. Otherwise, we will go ahead and turn it off again. Okay, go ahead.
So there are so many things, but something that jumps to mind are what we can call anomalous psychological behavior. And I'm thinking, something we talked about before, hallucinations, but in the modern world, what role they play. Also, spirit possession, channeling, and also hypnosis. That's just a suggestion. And the reason why I suggest those things is because these are things that are studied by psychologists, but they don't really have an overarching theory to fit everything together. But Jaynes did.
Sure. Let's do one thing. I want to talk about one thing. I want to begin discussing one thing today, if we have a little bit of time. So this bicameral nature. Okay, let's not talk about the bicameral theory. Let's just talk about right brain and left brain.
Okay.
What do we know about the right brain and the left brain?
Well, actually, I think we probably don't know as much as we think we do.
Mm-hmm.
So according to Jaynes, the idea, of course, was that during the bicameral period, the linguistic areas of the right hemisphere would generate auditory and visual hallucinations. It's more complicated than that. And then, of course, the left hemisphere would, if I can use the term, receive those messages, and that neurology has changed. But I don't like to use the word neurology. I actually prefer the word neuroculture. Because I think because Jaynes is misinterpreted, because people, when they read that part of the book, they assume that he is talking about a neuroanatomical change in the human brain. And that's not what he meant. What he meant was culture changed the brain, and culture is still changing the brain.
Okay, wonderful. So we will go ahead and we'll go through all of that. Now, let me see. I want to give one last chance for people to share their takeaways. So I want to just tell you what we are going to do is I am going to discuss with Brian how we are going to present this. What we're trying to do is that we're trying to present it as simply as possible, as easy to connect with your experience as possible, and in as interactive a way as possible, so we can deal with questions as they come up. It is an enormously difficult thing to talk about, and we are trying our best to talk about it. And even if you disagree, even if you, there are all kinds of disagreements, it doesn't matter. If you can get some perspective of somebody, it may be either one of us, or it may be somebody in your breakout room, or somebody who's speaking in their takeaways that you will be able to learn something from. But it is a topic which is, Jaynes calls it the greatest, a great inheritance of, our great cultural inheritance. I would call it our greatest cultural inheritance, because it's like everything else is made possible by it. Everything else that we have requires it. So that is what we are focused on. So we are just focused on the heart of the both cultural and individual. It is individual and cultural at the same time, but you have to make it your own. And by talking about it, by considering other people's views, is the way in which to expand your grasp over this inheritance. So that's what we are trying to do here. All right, let's see. We have got about 15 minutes to wrap up. Brian, do you want to make any kind of any points, any concluding thoughts or something like that?
I'll just make one point. That, I think so. The way you've done it, I think, is very useful, and I think part of your approach to get people to appreciate Jaynes, not that they may agree or agree with everything, is to encourage people, not just to read his book, of course, but to encourage people to think about their everyday life, their everyday experiences. So rather than trying to read some dry, difficult to understand academic article or book, think about your own experiences throughout the day. Think about your own consciousness. Think about the words you use to describe your consciousness. To what degree are they metaphoric? So in other words, I think this should be a project of self-discovery. And I think that way Jaynes starts to make more sense.
Precisely. Excellent. Excellent, Brian. So that was a great way of putting it. So folks, if you want to talk about what you are walking away with this meetup, you are welcome to do that. No questions at this point, or you can actually put questions because we'll get to questions. It's very, as always, in these meetups, if you are walking away with a great question, that is much more valuable than walking away with a conclusion. So it's like, questions are important because that is like, after doing all the thinking, this is what you need to focus on. So let's start with Kevin and Dave, and even folks who have not spoken before or who are familiar with Julian Jaynes, if you have any comments about how we are doing this, because this is new. We have never tried, I've never tried to do something of this magnitude before. And we are trying to kind of communicate, complexity of ideas. So any feedback would be good. So Kevin followed by Dave. Keep it about a minute or so, not more than that. Kevin. Oh, just a second. I need to unmute everybody. Go ahead, Kevin, go ahead.
There you go. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Brian. I got a lot to say actually, but I try to keep short. Metaphor is big. It's something is Brian a little bit different. Brian said people need a very specific thing. Let's see, describe. They don't have. They try use. Actually, I'm from China originally. We not just think about things. Sometimes we have a head, a brain. We talk about the computer. We call that electric brain. We easily understand from perception into language. So we don't need to recreate the new, very specific. That's one thing different Western culture and Chinese. We like try use literal understand the word. Second one about the qi, that word. That qi actually original from China, I would say. It's like back to a century ago. A few words in Japanese, they slowly learn Chinese words. Then the more the Chinese try keep their identity, keep the Japanese way. Similar happen in Korean. Like Korean, we cannot read. About Japanese word, we cannot read it. So it's the qi, for example, of air. The human being need air. Aging air, we got a very specific word, very cross use metaphor way. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Dave.
Thanks,
Dave, how was the meetup?
Yeah, and Brian, very good presentation. Off track just a little bit. We talk about left brain and right brain quite often, but there's a cable of nerves that connect the two together and they can actually talk to each other. And there's been very interesting experiments on people who've had that cable severed and about perception, what you see in the right eye, what you said with your left side of the brain. So I know it's a little bit off track, but I think it's worth considering. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. That's go ahead, Brian.
Well, yes, you're right. In fact, I think that was that research back in the 60s and 70s with a split brain, I think was one of the inspiring lines of research for Jaynes, because what they discovered is that when you split the brain, the corpus callosum actually you can have two different minds. It's kind of a strange way to look at things, but yes, that's a very important point.
Paul, go ahead, ask your question. Paul, you need to unmute. Okay, let me go ahead and ask it for him. Paul asks, I would like for an explanation of the difference between metaphor and analogy.
That's a actually Jaynes does make that distinction. I use the words interchangeably. I probably should not. And I to be honest with you, I can't really give an answer right now. But if you have a way of explaining the difference, like I said, there is a specific on a specific page, Jaynes does make that distinction. The reason why I don't distinguish it too much myself, I don't really necessarily see why it's important for what I'm trying to say. But in any case, if you have something to say about that, of course, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I think the thing that is common to both of them, which is, again, what I focus on, is that you have something that you're more familiar with, and you're using that in order to understand something that you're less familiar with. That is the general pattern. Now, the interesting thing is that when you start doing that, you suddenly have all these things that are associated with this first thing that you're very familiar with, and those also get carried with your metaphor. And I think he has terms for it. What does he call it? Metafran,
metafire, parafran, paraphire. It gets a little bit complicated.
Yes, but the idea is that there are all kinds of. It's not just the denotations, but also the connotations. Everything that comes along with that. He gives examples of a blanket of snow. So when you say blanket of snow, immediately, the thing that you're more familiar with is a blanket on a bed. And then you're saying the earth is being blanketed. But along with that, it says that, okay, it's going to be warm, it is protected, it is kind of cozy, and all those feelings are transferred, with the metaphor. Next up is Seth. Seth, what are your takeaways? How are we doing with these meetups? You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, hi. Well, one of the things that I did learn earlier today was the difference between a metaphor and an analogy. And just to make it quick, an analogy, a metaphor is when you use a familiar concept to describe an unfamiliar concept, and an analogy would be to use an abstract concept to depict a actual concept, like a map and the world. But my takeaway for today, first of all, I did enjoy your presentation, and I think the format, I mean, I got a lot out of it, and I'm just fascinated by evolution and the and consciousness and human consciousness. That I think that within evolution just takes thousands and hundreds of thousands, tens and thousands of years to evolve. But the mind seems to evolve at a much faster rate. I mean, I don't think evolve is even the right term to use. So definitely will be paying attention to the future meetups here, and I'm looking forward to learning more. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Seth. And that's absolutely true. Give me just a second. Let me mute. Give me a second. Yeah. So the speed is vital, because we're talking about just 30 generations in which what we've achieved, is just incredible. And the process is also very different. Evolutionary process, people think of evolution, but it's evolution by natural selection. So that means that genes are being passed, there is a variation in genes, and then most of them fail, and some of them are a little bit more effective in surviving and reproducing. That is the process of evolution. The process of consciousness is different. So there is progress. I think progress, and it is more directional, it is more intentional, it is able to see the future. That's where I'm going to go, and that's how I'm going to get there. Evolution is not like that. So it's like it is, those are different. Those are different, and the differences, you're right in pointing out the differences between those things. All right, so I'm very excited. I think Brian, this is very, very good start. I think we went very slowly. We nailed some of the concepts. I think many people got it. But folks, this is very, very deep. Okay, what we are doing is that we're just giving you a small little map of some things. But what the territory that we are pointing to, the work of Julian Jaynes is profound. I put link, search for, Julian Jaynes in Amazon. His book published in 1974, Origins of Consciousness, is what you really need to read, because you would get a lot more from these discussions if you come to it. Because ideally, I would love it if you start reading the book, and then we can have discussions at a much deeper level. People who have been studying his work for past 20 years, like 20 plus years, like Brian, still have many, 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 many things that they're trying to figure out, because he was way ahead of his time. And the other thing I definitely want to do is to connect all those ideas with other people's ideas, like Daniel Kahneman's ideas and Carl Jung's ideas, and every ideas that we can find, so we can triangulate and figure out what these things mean, and what is unique about Jaynes, and what is common between Jaynes and other folks. So that's what we're going to do. And thank you very much for coming. This was a fantastic meetup. Thank you very much. Let me tell you what's coming up next at 2:30. At 2:30, we're going to be talking about the kind of people Julian Jaynes is. He's a polymath. He's transdisciplinary. That is one of his powers. So we're going to be talking about every other Sunday. We talk about polymaths on Sundays, and on every Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern time, we do that as well. So today we are going to be talking about paradoxes of polymathy. Dr. Angela Cortellessa, who has done her PhD on studying polymaths in the 21st century, who will be here, along with two guests who will be talking about this topic. So that we're going to start at 2:32. So as people remind me, I can keep doing these meetups forever, but apparently people need to take bathroom breaks and stuff like that, or get something to eat or something like that. So this is a good time to do that. And we will continue the meetup at 2:30. Brian, this was, I think it worked out well. It worked out even better than what I had hoped for.
Yes.
What did you think?
Well, at this point, yes, I'm very impressed. And again, I think your idea of taking ideas of Jaynes piecemeal, step by step, because in order to understand Jaynes, you have to do it step by step. There's no way that understanding consciousness can come in one definition, in one paragraph. It's really a very personal, as I said before, a type of self-discovery to figure out what Jaynes was trying to get at.
Wonderful. All right, so folks, we'll see you. We'll continue this next week on Sunday at 12 o'clock. I'll be announcing the meetup soon, and we'll recap what we have said today very briefly, and then we will build on it. We'll do kind of the next level of concepts on that.
And I want to thank everybody, because I truly mean that. I think the questions were all very, very well put, and I can see people are really beginning to get a handle on what Jaynes is about. And I know that's not easy.
No, Brian, I mean, that's part of our community. That's who we are. Everybody comes here to learn. Everybody comes here with everything that they know, and they are asking questions, and they are actually trying to listen to the presenters and to each other to see what the other person is saying and try to kind of process it themselves they kind of bring out whatever questions that they have, whatever disagreements that they have, and we go back and forth for that. And so I think this is a perfect place. And like, if we can learn how to do that, hopefully we can communicate Jaynes' ideas to other folks as well through the YouTube videos, and we can get them here maybe next time. All right. Thank you, Brian. Really appreciate it.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you. No, bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Oh,
Bye. Thank you.